Jenny and Becca, the handout here is the same one as yesterday, so you might not need that, but I have extras just in case. Okay, well, we've got 8:30, so why don't we get started? Good morning, S&P.
Good morning.
Oh, we can do a little better than that. Good morning, S&P.
Good morning.
Oh, that's a lot better. I got a lot more acoustic energy out of that second response. So there's our oriented response. Welcome to Wednesday of week number 12. And just a couple of reminders about where we're going in the today's session and also in sessions to come. So here we are talking about localizing sounds. I hope you enjoyed the video that we had for today. We also didn't quite finish everything that we had wanted to talk about with regard to the blind watchmaker. Just one or two questions on our long list of questions that we didn't get to, so I thought we'd go over that today. And I also thought I'd just give you an idea about how you might prepare for Friday's session. For Friday, if you'll just read what's on the syllabus, that'll be CP 22, Course Pack 22. This is one of the first articles that I published when I was at Denison with a student who was in our class. His name is Ray Stanley. He graduated in 2003, even though he took this course, I think, as a junior in the fall of 2001. It was my first semester here. So Ray and I met, and we started working in my lab on some localization issues. We talked about sound localization, and we created a paper on that, and we published that paper in 2003. So Ray went on to Georgia Tech, where he was able to get a PhD, and he knows a lot about sound localization and actually makes a living on auditory phenomena. So we're going to try something new on Friday. We're going to Skype Ray in, and to prepare us for that, what I'd like you to do is the following. First, of course, read the article that's in the course pack, and as we typically do, we have these sessions on When I Teach, I Learn, so be able to explain, at least to a novice, the gist of the paper, what some of the manipulations were. It might not be that you get all the details, but I think you'll get a lot of them, especially after what we've been talking about this week and last week. So I think most of it will make sense. It's okay if you don't get all of it, but be able to explain it to a novice. That will set you up really, really well. And then along the way, you might make a vocabulary list. There might be a few terms there that you're not fully understanding, but if you can make a vocab list and maybe look those things up on Wiki, or if you can't find them on Wiki, you can bring in your vocabulary questions and we'll try to answer them here in class. Ray also asked for me to do this. Ray has had 10 years of life experience after graduating from Denison, and he remembers this class very well. And so he wanted to know if you had any life after Denison questions for him. So it would be good if you think about those. This is a real chance to talk directly with one of our alums on anything regarding maybe graduate school or professional life, or what helped him most from his overall Denison education, or what helped him least from his overall Denison education. Any questions that he has on reflecting on S&P or anything along those lines. I think it'd be a really, really good opportunity. One other thing, I think I recall from a recent concert here on campus that Bobby McFerrin is coming later on this year. Has anybody heard about that, or can anybody confirm that? It is Bobby McFerrin. Okay, so the last time Bobby McFerrin was here, Ray was a senior, so it's been 10 years. But he was here. Bobby McFerrin is a singer, an extraordinary singer. Maybe we'll take a quick look at one of his videos, because he has a lot to say about music and neuroscience and audition and hearing and all of that. The last time he was here for like 2 days on campus, and he gave us, I think, maybe 2 different concerts, but he also went to classes. And he went to a dance class, he went to a physics class, he talked about the physics of sound and so forth as a vocalist. So really interesting stuff. And when he was here, I think Ray got to be on stage with him. Ray was a singer also. So the person we'll have Skyping in with us was a S&P student who was on stage, I believe, if I recall correctly, with Bobby McFerrin, who's coming back this year. So really nice 10-year anniversary on a lot of different levels. Okay, any questions about what we're doing Friday? Okay, so we'll do some reading, we'll create a vocab list, be able to explain it to a novice, and we'll come up with some kind of question about life after Denison with Ray, and I think he'll really enjoy that. This will be our first ever Skype session, so I'm looking forward to that. Okay, I wonder if we can take just one step back and remind us of where we were in our conversation regarding good design by Dawkins, and we got as far as this, and we talked even a little bit about it, but I think a little bit of review is okay. So we ended on the "We Be Jammin" slide. Can we all say it together? We be jammin'? Everybody? Yeah. We be jammin'. Okay, right. And then we talked about this problem of jamming. Can somebody just remind us what the problem is and maybe how the bats solve it? We'll take one of those at a time. What is the problem of jamming? Thanks, Briella.
I think it's like all the bats will be using echolocation at the same time, so then they're all hearing each other's signals.
Yeah, right. They're all hearing each other's signals. So which one is mine, right? Okay, if I'm trying to chase my own mosquito, get your own mosquito, I'm going after this one. How do I disregard all of those echoes becomes an interesting issue. Jenny, do you want to add something to that or go on to the next one?
Next one.
Okay, please, yeah.
I forget exactly what it's called, but it's with like realizing what's in their immediate, like what makes sense in their echolocation, like surround.
Okay.
So they kind of ignore or like disregard other echoes that wouldn't completely make sense or it's really close with the ones that they're.
Yeah, right. So we're looking for something that's coherent over time, right? So there's one pattern of echoes that would make sense from my perspective, but a very different pattern of echoes might make sense from, say, Owen's perspective. So what I need to do is pick up on what makes sense over time and eliminate those things that are essentially strange, right? And so Dawkins called this a strangeness filter, and I think Harshita reminded us of that last time, the strangeness filter. So it's an interesting idea, right? And then what we can say is, well, is there any evidence for the strangeness filter, or how can we begin to zoom in on that? It's a big concept, the strangeness filter. How do you begin to operationalize that? Who remembers talking about operationalizations in our research courses in Psych 200? Okay, so how do you begin to operationalize it? Well, what we have today is a handout that doesn't quite get all the way to the strangeness filter, but I think it takes an important step in that direction. And what I found really exciting about this was I was in this laboratory, at least I was in this building back at Brown University. This came out just 2 years ago. So what I'll do is just break out of this for a moment, ask you to pull out the handout, and this is on page 1 of the handout. It says bats use echo harmonic structure to distinguish their targets from background clutter. Okay? So let me project it up front. There it is up front, and you have it in front of you. Can we get a volunteer reader just to start at the abstract? It's only one paragraph. Thank you, Emily.
When echolocating, big brown bats find complex surroundings. Echoes arriving from irrelevant objects, clutter, located to the sides of their sonar beam, can mask perception of relevant objects located to the front targets, causing blind spots. Because the second harmonic is beamed more weakly to the sides than the first harmonic, these clutter echoes have a weaker second harmonic. In psychophysical experiments, we found that electronically misaligning first and second harmonics in echoes to mimic the misalignment of corresponding narrow responses to harmonics and clutter echoes disrupts the bat's echo delay perception, but also prevents clutter masking. Electronically offsetting harmonics to realign their narrow responses restores delay perception, but also clutter interference. Thus, bats exploit harmonics to distinguish clutter echoes from target echoes, sacrificing delay or acuity to suppress masking.
Okay, really good. Thank you, Emily. All right, so there's a bit of terminology in there. Sometimes they're shooting for clarity, they're shooting for succinctness, and sometimes it's a little bit hard to follow. So let's see if we can just pick up on maybe a few synonyms that might be helpful to us. If we think about the word clutter, every time they use clutter here, they're really talking about jamming. This problem that I'm trying to track that particular mosquito, but so are lots of other bats trying to track their respective mosquitoes, or maybe we're all going after the same mosquito. How do we get rid of these nuisance kinds of echoes? We'll call that clutter. We could have called it jamming. Who's okay with that? Okay, so then if you're beginning to review this for a test, you can think of clutter as jamming. June, this is the handout that we had from the other day. Nothing new here. There's also some conversation about harmonics. And what a harmonic is. There's first harmonic, second harmonic. Who remembers hearing about that in this class? First and second harmonics? Okay. Anybody want to remember how we define that? It's been a while, and we haven't spent a lot of time on harmonics. People remember? Yeah, please go ahead, Harshit.
Wasn't the fundamental the main one?
Yeah, the main frequency or the lowest frequency, right?
The harmonic is integer multiples.
Really good. So we might have a really low component. Remember, we have these Fourier series, so you can hear my voice. My voice has all these sine wave components in it. Me as an image, as you're looking up here, as you're looking over here, the image is landing on your retina. We have all these sinusoidal components. The lowest one is called the fundamental. And then if we have integer multiples of those integer multiples are called the harmonics. Who's okay with that? Okay. So what they're saying is that maybe the lowest harmonic, which is the first harmonic that's going to be the fundamental frequency, that's got the most energy, but then the second harmonic will have less energy, and any one target is going to have its own first and second harmonics and so forth. And we're getting the strongest signal from first harmonic from the target, but then there are things around the target, right, that are creating these nuisance echoes that might be jamming us up. And so we want to figure out how do we disregard all of that. So what I thought was really helpful was I went on to Wiki and looked at harmonic, and I found a beautiful, I think, absolutely gorgeous dynamic icon. If I can take this down just for a moment, okay? So here's the icon, and what they're showing us here is 1 times the fundamental frequency. 440 is the frequency that they're using here. Does anybody know what 440 corresponds to on the piano, by the way? What note? I think it's a good guess. It's actually the A above middle C. It's the A above middle C. And this is a very famous note for tenors. I used to try to sing tenor. I didn't do it very successfully. But that's the note that a lot of tenors try to hit. If you can get up there, you've got a pretty good tenor range. I almost never got there, and now I surely can't get there anymore. So we can multiply that by 1, and we get this kind of a wave. And you might see that the air molecules are collapsing or contracting and expanding. We're getting compressions and rarefactions. Who's okay with that in the first one? And then what we can do is multiply that by 2. So we take that, multiply it by the next integer. Somebody said integer multiples here. I think it was Harshita. So we go from 440 to 880. And now instead of having this half wave, we get the full wave. And it's changing over time, going from rarefaction to compression to rarefaction to compression. And you can see the air compressing and rarefying. People following that. Does that work for us? Okay. And then we can do the same thing here at the 3rd harmonic. Okay, now you can see, and now you can see, I think, the 4th harmonic also. And it's interesting to compare maybe the 2nd and 4th harmonic. They're an octave apart from each other. And here I think you'll see there are 2 compressions. Here comes again, zing and zing, right? Okay, then they rarefy and so forth. So what they're saying here is that how do bats solve this problem of jamming? And this problem of clutter. How do they go about doing that? And what they do in their experiment at Brown University is they start playing different kinds of recordings to bats as the bats are trying to land on things or the bats are trying to move around their environment. And what they play around with is the relative timing of the 1st and 2nd harmonics. So they're manipulating those two. Okay? So they're taking this component from the signal, that component from the signal. They might make one louder, one softer. They might delay one. After you've got them recorded, you can actually shift one of them left or right. You can delay them by a little bit, and you start messing up the sound and seeing, which components of the sound are really driving the bat's behavior. Who's following the general idea? Is that working for us? Okay. So you could have decomposed this into many, many different harmonics. They're looking at the 1st and the 2nd harmonics here because they had some reason to believe that that might be particularly relevant. Okay. All right, let's take the lights back on up. And then what we'll do is we'll talk just a little bit about this idea of acuity, delay acuity. That's one of the things that they're measuring. So normally the 1st and 2nd harmonics might be in register with each other, okay? But then I can take maybe the 2nd harmonic, I guess I'll do it here as a 2nd harmonic. They take the 2nd harmonic and they start delaying it. They put it a little bit later in time, or they could have made it earlier in time. First, who's following that? Is that working for? Okay, so I used to play drums, and when we played drums, we used to do something called flamming. Has anybody heard of flams before? Okay, so the idea would be this. This is going to be your target. Okay, it's the chalk sound that I'm going to hit here. Okay, that's the acoustic target. You're trying to track that, and this is going to be something that might jam you. This is going to be some piece of clutter, and that makes a different kind of a sound. Okay, and so what we can do is we can play them at the same time. Or once we have a recording of that, we can begin filtering it like this, and then take one of those components and shift it a little bit later in time. So we might get, instead of this, we might get. Who's okay with that? Okay, and then I can make it a really big delay. I can make it or I can begin to close that down a little bit. I can even reverse it. I can have this come first and this come second. Okay, right? And what we could do, if we were so inclined, is we could create a psychometric function where this chalk is your target sound, and it's either coming first or it's coming second on any given trial. So here they're pretty much simultaneous. Here the chalk is wave first. Here the chalk is wave second. And that gets us along this axis, where the target, the piece of chalk, is either coming relatively early or relatively late, and the distractor is coming late or early. Yeah, please.
Is your hand the electronic device that they're using, or what is that referred to?
So this will just be, this is going to be the 2nd harmonic. Okay, you can think of this as being, these are the different harmonics, and so typically they're in register. But now that we've electronically recorded all these, we can decompose them. And then once we've got them decomposed, we can grab this guy and we can shift him this way or that way and then play it back. And so normally it would sound like this, but if I take the 2nd guy and I delay him, I get a flam. And I can make it a really obnoxious flam or just a really subtle flam. Okay? And then I can measure, have you basically say to us, which came first, the chalk or the hand, right? Okay? And so we're getting some kind of temporal acuity. How good are you at determining that delay? Okay? And so we have distractor first, target first, and you have a two alternative force choice response, and you can either say target first, which would be the chalk first, or you would say distractor first, which would be my hand first. And as we're manipulating the interval between those, we can track this, and we can see what kind of psychometric function you get. We can measure the steepness of it. We can measure its x-intercept. For a show of hands, who remembers the x-intercept bit? Okay, and the steepness would give us some indication of precision. Harshita has a question? Yeah.
Actually, do. You said that the second harmonic is less energy than the first?
Yes, right.
But it's got more frequency. How?
Okay, so energy would be amplitude. Remember FAPO? Okay. Do you remember FAPO?
Yep.
Okay. So frequency is the F in FAPO. Okay.
They're not related.
They're orthogonal. Yeah, I guess that's a good way of saying it. They're not related. Okay. So we could now once you've got it digitally, you could actually crank that thing up if you wanted to. Right. You could once you've got it digitally and you can decompose it, you can do all kinds of things. You can delay it. You can eliminate it. Right? You can make it louder. Right. You can do all kinds of things. But all they're doing is playing around with that flam, and they're measuring how well this is happening. Okay. All right.
How would you do two alternative force choices of that?
Okay, yeah, so how do you do two? So there are different ways of doing it. You might have the animal do differential flying. So just like with young children, how do we know that young children can see things or respond to things? Jenny probably knows all about this. Some idea, Jenny, how we do this with infants? How do we know if they do numerosity, or they can tell 3s and 4s?
An easy way when they're really young is like a looking time
Okay.
task where you can measure the amount of time they look at something. And
Okay.
it depends how much, like, whether they understand it or don't. Kind of thing.
Okay, right. So there's a looking time measure. You also can have two stimuli on one side, and you see which one they orient to, if that works. And so if you have a baby, it can be looking time. If you have a fish, it could be swimming. They could swim to the left or swim to the right on trial after trial after trial. And then you've got different levels of difference going on there. Maybe you've got a really broad delay or a smaller delay, and you see how well they discriminate. Okay? Okay. All right, so who's following that so far? We can come up with some kind of delay acuity, we can measure the threshold, and then we can plot that, for example, over here. Okay? And here, better acuity will be better performance. It's kind of like your visual acuity. When you go to have an eye test, you want to have really high visual acuity. What they're reporting in this is they have some other index of jamming. How vulnerable is the animal to jamming? How easily distracted might the animal be by these surrounding echoes? And it turns out that there's a trade-off that goes on here. And that is that if you have, for a given moment, the animal can change its acuity level and have really, really precise acuity in time. So it can tell the difference between this and this. And they're very similar, but there's a distinction to be made, and they can tell that. So they're really high on acuity. During those moments, though, they are also very vulnerable to jamming. Okay? They get jammed very easily. Okay? So if you want to get rid of some clutter, how do you do that? Well, you can actually surrender some of your delay acuity, and now you're not so good on this task, but you can filter out those distracting bits of clutter. So the animal can now trade at any given moment its delay acuity for its susceptibility to jamming. What a fun finding that is. So this was published in the journal called Science, which is a very prestigious journal, and it came out just, in fact, I think it was even less than 2 years ago, or about 2 years ago. A really interesting finding by taking advantage of this, digitally manipulating the stimulus, figuring out what the delay acuity is, and how it might co-vary with jamming. Yeah, please.
Isn't that, bad though? The fact that they're vulnerable to feeling?
Okay, right, so isn't it bad? I think that if the bats could speak, they might say, we are delighted to have the flexibility. There might be a particular moment where it really helps you if you're almost on top of your mosquito. Okay? What's neat about this is there probably aren't going to be a whole lot of distractors right there. Okay? If you think about a broader span, that mosquito can be just about anywhere, and we need to get rid of a lot of distractors. By this point, the number of distractors in that small region of space is probably not that big. So I'll increase my vulnerability to jamming because I'm probably not going to get jammed by a lot of things around there. But I do need to get down to maybe millimeter resolution, so I need really good delay acuity, right? Because time is going to be space on this moving target, right? If we have just in a millisecond or two, that animal might move its position just a little bit. So we need to get really good spatial and temporal precision, and we're willing to become a little bit more vulnerable to jamming. If I've got a broader picture, I don't have any idea where that mosquito is, I need to start getting rid of some clutter. Okay? So it's good that the animal, I guess, has flexibility, but it can't have everything. It can't have complete immunity to jamming with also really high acuity, but it can trade it off.
So it can do both, right?
Yeah, as one is getting better, the other is getting worse, but it seems to have been really effective evolutionarily. So very good. Yes, please, Emily's got a question.
So could you call that y-axis on that graph vulnerability?
Yeah, vulnerability to jamming maybe is better. In fact, why don't I put that in here? I'll put in B-U-L-N, vulnerability to jamming. Okay? So we can be really vulnerable, but we can have really great delay acuity, and we can trade those off depending on where we are in our chase for that mosquito, the much coveted mosquito. Okay? Who's following that? Workforce? Okay. There's one video that I thought I'd play for us. I think you'll really enjoy this. I'll turn down the lights. And this is how the mosquitoes and the moths that are being eaten are going to fight back. Okay? They actually have an opportunity maybe to fight back against this bat that's zooming in with all this terrific neural machinery that's been measured at Brown University. So here we go.
Using echolocation, a bat attacks a tiger, Batholdia trigonus, but the moth responds with a loud defensive clicking noise. The sound confuses the bat by disrupting its sonar system. It can no longer find the moth. The moth's sonar jamming mechanism is located in its thorax, in an organ called the timbal, which can vibrate at 4,500 beats per second. This is what it sounds like slowed down 30 times. High-speed footage shot by biologist Aaron Corcoran shows that other moth species who remain silent when under attack stand little chance of escaping the bats. Corcoran says Batholdia trigonus sonar jamming defense mechanism has possible application in the design of deterrence to protect bats from wind turbines or tall buildings, demonstrating, as both creatures instinctively understand, that there's more to the moth than bat food.
Okay, there it is. All right, so really interesting arms race that goes on. This is what biologists call this from time to time, that one of the animals develops some kind of mechanism. It has echolocation, but then the echolocation is vulnerable to jamming. But then I can change my jamming vulnerability by trading it with delay acuity. Okay, now the moths start fighting back by having their own blocking mechanism, right? And the moths that can block might live another day, and the moths that can't block perhaps don't live another day. So there's a lot going on acoustically between these animals that you and I would be pretty much unaware of most of the time. Go ahead, Emily.
So with the moths, what do you call this thing?
Yeah, right.
Would that be like your hand?
Okay, yeah, you might think of it that way, right? It's a lot of clutter, okay? And now what's going on is, even as you're getting close to this thing, the target itself is putting out clutter, okay? And it might be difficult for the bat to disregard that. Right. Now maybe it can trade enough acuity. Now that's actually very interesting. So as the bat is homing in, it has high acuity, but it's also very vulnerable to jamming. So now all the moth needs to do is put up some kind of a signal, and that might be enough to throw the thing off. Really cool, yeah.
So you could say that the moth did what these guys electronically did
Yeah, right.
in the
Yeah.
experiment.
Right, right. Yeah, usually the moths are ahead of us, right? So, and just as we talked about earlier, people didn't know about sonar in the 1930s and 40s. This was an attempt to figure out how to build better airplane attacks and ship attacks and so forth. And they were quite surprised to learn that bats have been doing this for millions of years and doing it with great, great precision. Right? Very, very interesting. Okay. All right, so I think we've said enough about jamming and all the great research that jamming can generate. What an interesting problem it is behaviorally and acoustically. Okay, so here we have this notion of the internal representation. This is question number 9 from the sheet that we were working on the other day. So Dawkins suggests that a bat's perception or a human's perception of the world depends on an internal representation. And that we got that idea again from what Harshita was describing yesterday as the strangeness filter. So we're somehow representing the real world out there. Anybody have an idea of how we might define an internal representation or whether we think they're necessary for perception? This requires a lot of speculation on our part. This wasn't stated directly in the reading. Yeah, thanks, Becca.
An internal representation is just a way that an organism makes meaning of a stimulus.
Okay, right. It's a way for an organism to make meaning of a stimulus. I think that's a perfectly good definition. Here's another one, another definition that might and be helpful for you. We can think of a representation as a correspondence between two systems. Okay? That's what a representation is. A correspondence between two systems. And the two systems that are most relevant for a course like this, in fact, a lot of psychology, not just a course like this, would be the state of your brain, that's one system, and then the state of the world, that's the other system. Right? So in this case, the bat is using its neural activity to try to home in and pick up something from the environment, try to grab that moth for lunch. Okay? So it needs to know what's in one system, that's the world, and what's going on in my brain. Okay? And if we put those two together, then maybe the bat can wind up getting lunch. And if the bat gets jammed in some way, then maybe there's going to be a miscorrespondence between the two, and it's not going to be able to get its lunch. Okay? So do we need some kind of formal representation? Now, there are different ideas about this. Somebody like Helmholtz had constructivism. Who remembers hearing about constructivism in Helmholtz? He would say that we have, as part of our representation, our correspondence, we have all of these statistical bits that some things are more likely than others to occur in the real world. Right? Some things are more likely than others. And we have some idea about that statistically, and that's represented rather permanently in our memory. Then we might have something like the ecological approach, which tries to say, we don't really need the representations. We have the information available to us in the real world, and all we have to do is walk around and pick it up. And there's a lot of relational information in the real world, so we don't have to store it as a representation in our brain. Right? So we go back and forth between those two. How much does the brain have to store by way of representation or formal correspondence versus how much can the environment provide to us on the fly at any given moment that we just pick up? Okay? So there isn't really a direct answer to this question, but that just gives us an opportunity to go back and think about constructivism versus ecological optics, and the bats might have that debate themselves. There might be a Gibsonian bat and a Helmholtzian bat that would argue for having these representations or not. Okay. Dawkins describes a logical fallacy known as the argument from personal incredulity. Can somebody help us out with what the argument from personal incredulity is? Okay, we'll go with Owen and then with Becca.
All right, so the argument of personal incredulity is saying that something is very unlikely based on your personal disbelief of it. He was citing many times where someone who was against evolution would be, I can't believe that a polar bear would develop that white because the seals can't see it. Whereas, it really just, for behavioral biologists, that's something that's very easy to be able to understand. And then even for a polar bear, it's even more salient to understand how camouflage.
Okay, right. So the fact that somebody is incredulous about it or doesn't believe it doesn't mean that it's untrue. I mean, sometimes when people are debating, all you have to say, what some people will offer is, gee, I find that difficult to believe. And it might be the case that they find it difficult to believe, but that doesn't really speak to its truth or falsity. Okay? So here's something that I found difficult to believe, but I actually do now believe it. Can we flip over and we'll read one more paragraph? This is yet another thing that goes on in the world of acoustics. I found this absolutely spectacular. And this is now Floral Acoustics, conspicuous echoes of a disc-shaped leaf attract bat pollinators. Would somebody volunteer to read this one for us? Okay, thank you, Kirsten.
The visual splendor of many diurnal flowers serves to attract visually guided pollinators such as bees and birds, but it remains to be seen whether bat-pollinated flowers have evolved
Analogous?
echoacoustic signals to lure their echolocating pollinators. Here we demonstrate how an unusual dish-shaped leaf displayed above the inflorescences of the vine Moravia evanica attracts bat pollinators. Specifically, this leaf's echoes fulfilled requirements for an effective beacon. That is, they were strong, multi-directional, and had a recognizable and varied echo signature. In behavioral experiments, presence of the leaves have foraging time for flower visiting bats.
Okay, thank you. So now even the leaves are getting in on this thing, right? So a moment ago, the moths were getting in on the action, right? They were trying to alter their acoustic surroundings by putting out one of these blocking bits. And now we have these leaves that are shaping in particular ways that they reflect sound either more effectively or less effectively. They reflect the sound maybe multidimensionally. So we hear the sound bouncing off in more directions. And what we find is that relative to the leaves that don't have this property, bats can get to these leaves twice as quickly. And when bats are landing there, they're presumably pollinating. So it's in the plant's interest to develop such a leaf. And really interesting that this is going on. So somehow even the leaves, which we think of as maybe the prototypical instrument for transducing solar energy or creating solar energy. They're taking in light and they might be able to convert that into food in some way. They're actually also now engaging in a different medium. It's the medium of sound rather than the medium of light, or I should say in addition to the medium of light. Was there a question or comment?
Yeah. Why would a bat go to a flower? Because bats don't eat flowers.
I guess, you know what it might be? I wonder if they're attracted to flowers because that's where bugs are. Okay, so maybe that's, for them, that's where the money is. You know, the old saying, why did you rob the bank? Well, because that's where the money is. So maybe flowers are kind of like banks. That would be my guess. Maybe somebody has a better idea about that. But at least what they're showing here behaviorally is that it does increase, reduce the travel time. So bats get there faster. Yeah, please.
There are multiple species of bats.
Oh yeah, lots of species of bats.
A good majority of them are actually insect eaters, but are more or less like either fruit eaters.
Ah, okay.
Basically perform the same tasks as hummingbirds, where they
Okay.
try to just eat nectar.
Great.
Flowers. Depends on the type of bat.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I knew there were lots of species. I didn't realize that. I thought they all ate some variety of insect, but maybe some of them really do feed directly on the flowers. So thank you, June. That's good to know. Okay, so even the leaves are in on the game, right, acoustically. Okay, I would have found that incredulous. I would have been incredulous about that, but there that is. Okay, so now we'll just take a moment to look at some other kinds of fallacies. I'm a big fan of logical fallacies. One of my many favorite courses when I was an undergraduate was a course in philosophy where we talked about logic. And so here are some other fallacies that you'll run into fairly frequently. We've talked a little bit about some of these once before, but it's been a while. So this is in a PowerPoint file called Structurally Similar Arguments. It's available to you out on the S drive. You might just find this to be really interesting, and it might help you as a person who will be a persuasive writer in the future. Okay? So here's a couple of arguments. If it rains, the sidewalk will be wet. The sidewalk is wet, therefore it rained. Okay? It looks like a pretty simple propositional argument. Okay, let's go to another one. If there is an intelligent designer, then there should be complex life forms. There are complex life forms, therefore there is an intelligent designer. Okay? So one of these arguments is about wet sidewalks and wet streets, and the other one is about the intelligent designer. So they seem to be about very, very different things, but structurally they're very similar. They both have the same abstract form. Who's following that? Is that working for us? Okay. And the form might be something like this. If P, then Q, Q therefore P. And we can allow Q and P's to be variables, and it can be about anything. It can be about something relating to how bats are fruit eating, or they're insect eating, or they're getting jammed or they're not. It can be about intelligent designers. It can be about wet sidewalks. Any kind of argument that you could have on a liberal arts campus, and we hope that you have a lot of arguments on a liberal arts campus. We can begin to take a step back and just try to code the argument that you're hearing in terms of maybe P's and Q's as somebody's coming to a deduction. Okay? And this is actually a fallacy called affirming the consequent. Right? This is a logical fallacy called affirming the consequent. Let me see if I can tell you why it's called affirming the consequent. So we have this structure, if P, then Q. The one that comes first is called the antecedent. Right? It comes before, right? And then the one that comes second is called the consequent. It's a consequence of. Okay? So if this, then that, it's a consequence of. So if P, then Q, what we're saying is Q is true, therefore we're inferring that P is true. We're affirming the consequent, the second piece of this, and we're claiming that by virtue of the fact that that's true, then this thing must be true. Okay? Right? And that's actually a logical fallacy. It could turn out to be true, but it wouldn't have to be true. It wouldn't follow of necessity. So this is a structural flaw. Right? This kind of argument is a structural fallacy, and it's got a special name that philosophers and logicians call affirming the consequent. Who's following that? Let's see if we can go on to a different one. This is one that's a little bit similar but a little bit distinct also, and it's called the confusion of the inverse. So let's see if we can get one of these going here. All pregnant people are female. Tammy is female. Aha! Therefore, Tammy is pregnant. Okay, all right, okay. Now, everybody's laughing because that one's a pretty obvious fallacy, okay, but sometimes these things get a little bit more subtle. So here's another argument. All things made by the intelligent designer, that's ID, are very complex. The eye is very complex. Therefore, the eye is made by the intelligent designer. Okay, now, some people are persuaded by that, okay, but actually these two arguments, even though they're different in their particular topics, one's about pregnancy, one's about complex objects, they're structurally the same thing, and they take this form abstractly. All x are y, z is y, therefore z is x. Okay, they all take that form. And you can jot this down if you want to now, but you don't have to. This is available to you on the S drive. Okay, so this is a kind of fallacy that turns out to be the confusion of the inverse. Every once in a while you'll get lucky, and this will happen to be true, but it doesn't follow of necessity. Okay? So when we're talking about where these complex structures like the eye or echolocating ability come from, people have some ideas about this, and they begin trying to put propositions together, and they use this propositional logic, but sometimes they make propositional errors, maybe the confusion of the inverse, maybe affirming the consequent. Okay? All right. So we got onto that because the argument from personal incredulity was one of the logical fallacies in the chapter that we're reading. And now we've seen a couple of other logical fallacies. Okay, let's go on to our last one. It's our last question inside of the Blind Watchmaker's chapter on good design. Okay. And polar bears. I think it was Owen a moment ago talking about polar bears. They're very large. They're high reflectance animals. Whatever light hits them, a large fraction of that light bounces off. Another way of saying that is it looks white to you and me. That's what white means. They're reflecting a lot of the light. Do animals on which they feed easily see them? Okay. Harshad is saying no. What do we think? Are they easily seen or not so easily seen? They're really big. They're really white. Who's gonna miss? And you're probably right. They're not so easily seen, and that's because the ice is white, the snow is white, okay? So we have a white polar bear on a white background, okay? All right, so they're not so easily seen. Did you want to add to that?
Well, I was thinking, like, since they're also, they have to go into the water occasionally to get their prey. If you had a polar bear in the water and a prey was above it, then potentially in that situation it'd be easy to
see. There are moments when this will be the case that they actually are fairly easy to see, right? But there are other times when they're not so easy to see. Yeah, please.
Well, the prey animals may not necessarily like have strong eyes and stuff. I mean,
That could be, okay.
The visual environment in like where polar bears live doesn't necessarily have too many features that make eyesight all that important.
Okay.
It's basically barren and flat.
Okay.
Eyesight may not be the most important sense for most animals, therefore it's not really relevant.
Okay, so maybe they're not so easily seen for a couple of reasons, right? One idea might be maybe some of the prey animals don't have really well-developed visual systems. We're talking about bats today. Bats don't have really well-developed visual systems, although bats wouldn't be part of this arms race. But you can imagine that might be true of others. The other idea, maybe somebody else has another comment on this. Yeah, Briella's got one too.
As far as natural selection goes, if there were polar bears that were white, they probably weren't able to feed because the prey could see them run.
Yeah.
Swim or whatnot.
Right.
So that makes sense as to why they would white color would develop.
Yeah, right. So people here taken anybody here taken E&E, evolution, ecology and evolution, right? So yeah, camouflage is a recurring theme, right? How well camouflage are you? So if you're in a largely white environment, then having a white fur coat probably helps you. One more thing. Anybody remember the Michelson contrast formula? Who remembers hearing about the Michelson contrast formula? Okay. Does anybody remember what the formula was? Yeah, thanks.
L max minus L min over L max plus L min.
Okay, is that what you're going to say? You win also? Okay, so the difference between L max and L min. So if you're a white polar bear and you're the target and you're against a white background, L max and L min are about the same. It's white on white. Okay, so we get a difference, okay, of essentially 0 up top over a lot of white and a lot of white, a really big number. So we're going to wind up with really low contrast. And remember that our ganglion cells are responding to contrast. And this is true for lots and lots of animals, that their ganglion cells need contrast in order to get the visual response going. So one way of thinking about camouflage is how much contrast is there. And if you're a white animal on a white background, there's not a lot of contrast. And it's easy for you to sneak up on your prey. They won't even know that you're there, in most cases. Owen gave us a good counterexample. Maybe if you're at the right position near the water and you're coming out of dark water and you're white, you're very easily seen. But in most cases, that won't be true. Yeah, please.
Aren't polar bears huge though?
They're really big, okay? So let's say we have a really big Arctic and we have an almost as big polar bear.
You can sense them. I'm assuming that's how the prey developed. They would be able to sense vibrations.
Oh, okay, so vibrations, yeah, but now in order for them to be feeling the vibrations, we might need to be at a much closer distance, right? So if the polar bear had been purple striped, okay, you could see him from a really long way. You wouldn't need to feel the vibrations. By the time you're feeling the vibrations, it might be too late. Okay, all right. Okay, any other questions on Dawkins' chapter? Lots of fun issues come up, from RoboCup and RoboCop to echolocating bats and the moths that are trying to escape, and logical fallacies, lots of stuff. A chapter filled with ideas. Okay, so finally, we're up to today's activity, and we're talking about the localizing, and there was lots of different ideas here in our localizing video and our localizing PowerPoint. I'm going to change the view and go to slide sorter. And maybe we'll do it this way. Why don't we start out with a couple of ideas on what's clear and a couple of ideas maybe on what was not so clear. So we had lots of topics here. We were talking about things like IIDs and ITDs. Those were some of the ideas. We talked about azimuth, talked about elevation. So why don't we start out with a couple of things that you learned that were maybe clear. We'll go with Elise and then with Briella.
I just have a quick question. On the, in the reading, I think they called IIDs ILDs.
ILD? Integral level difference. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Thanks.
are they interchangeable?
Yes, they are. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And there was another one that I think I caught in the video. Sometimes ITDs are interoral phase differences. So sorry. Yeah. So when we talk about the intensity, we're talking about the level of sound that we have. Okay. So ILDs we can use interchangeably. Interoral level differences would be intensity differences. Okay. Okay, so that was a point of clarification. Thank you, Elise, for that. And Briella also had something, I think, that maybe you found new or that was clear for you?
I understood the difference between like the IID and I.
TD? Yeah, okay.
I did not understand the graphs.
Okay, we didn't understand the graphs so much. Okay, so we can do the graphs. Well, maybe somebody can help to walk us through the graphs. Why don't we take something like maybe this one? Is this a reasonable, you tell me what graph you'd like to start on. Is that one okay? Okay, real good. And maybe Becca can at least start us. We'll see how we go through.
The difference between the two here is that the top one is a higher frequency
Okay,
of a tone, and the bottom one is a much lower frequency.
okay, right.
And so your IID is going to be much higher for a higher frequency in the two. So the difference, you'll be able to tell the difference, and you'll be able to localize the sound at a much higher frequency, but you won't have that ability at a lower frequency.
Okay, okay. I think that works really well. That's a very nice description. And then maybe we'll go with June and then with Jenny.
Also in terms of both graphs, the degrees that are on the x-axis
Okay.
basically indicate where the direction from the sound was, where 0 would be facing right in front of you.
Okay. Excuse my back. Okay, right in front is this click.
The higher
Okay.
the number of degrees, the further and further away it goes from the front of your face up to 180 degrees,
Okay.
which is directly behind you.
Okay, yeah, right. Very, very good. Okay, so that helps us to understand that. So front, back, and this is 90 degrees away to either side. I just went to the door side, but I could have gone to the other side as well. So let's check in and see if we're starting to get some clarity for Brielle. Does that work? Okay. And then what we can say is that we don't get very large interoral intensity differences in the front or in the back, but if they're maybe 90 degrees away, off to my left, off to my right, we're getting very, very big level differences. Can somebody remind us? Becca was almost there. Maybe Jenny wants to pick up on why that's the case.
I think so. For the wavelength, I thought it was interesting.
Right.
Commenting on the wavelength for the smaller frequency then has a longer wavelength,
Uh-huh.
so it's easy to kind of like goes right around the head.
Yeah, right.
And versus the higher frequency having a smaller wavelength.
Yeah.
And so that causes the difference because it like takes longer to get to the other ear.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it takes longer. It's always moving at 343, but still, it's only this big. Okay, and something that big maybe can't wrap around something the size of my head, but a much lower frequency has a much longer wavelength, and that can easily wrap around my head. Okay, so it can make it to the other side. Okay, Thank you. And then Becca has something.
Isn't that also why our pinna is only able to pick up low or much higher frequencies, because it's able to make its way into the ear because the wavelength is much smaller?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point. Everybody has a pinna that's similar to the next person's pinna, but not identical to the next person's pinna. And those little perturbations that we get are going to be altering probably relatively high frequency, right? Because these are happening over very, very small regions of space, and we could match and figure out roughly what size of perturbations do we have in our pinna, and what kinds of frequencies would those correspond to. And that's going to be the range of frequencies that are going to be most affected by our pinna. Kirsten had a question or a comment. Yeah.
Well, I guess I just want to clarify this. The bottom part of the graph is like the zoomed in area of where they're showing like the difference in intent,
Okay, thank you. Maybe I can clarify this. This is really not a zoomed in part. So we have exactly the same x-axis here. As June was mentioning, we're going from straight ahead, front of the room, all the way to the back of the room, and then we have different angles going across this way. And that's true for this graph, which goes from 0 to 180, and from that graph. The reason this one differs from that one is they're different stimuli. Here we're playing a relatively low tone, and here we're playing a high tone. So give me a minute. I might be able to, I wonder if I can get these tones. I called up a tone generator for another demo. Online noise generator. Can I go home? Here's my tone. So can we get to 6,000? Oh, sorry. I had the volume all the way up. That's even loud for me. Okay, that's 6,000. You'd have no trouble localizing that. And what was our other guy, 200? Okay, I hope this comes across. Okay, all right, is that working for us? Yeah, okay. So what we did then, Kirsten, is we grabbed one of those two tones, the flute-like tone or the tuba tone, and we're playing it at different positions. We'll go with Yuen, she's in the middle of the room. Either we're playing it in front, or we're playing it in the back, or one of these angles along the way, and you have to try to localize it. And meanwhile, we've got the two little microphones in her two ears, and we're asking what kinds of intensity differences are we getting left ear versus right ear? And we get a big intensity difference when we play that shrieking 6,000 hertz tone, right? Okay, yeah, great, okay. Thank you. A couple of other comments or questions. Harshita's got something. Let's go back to our picture.
Yeah, on the graph it goes from 0 to 180.
Yeah.
What if we did all 360? Is that just a mirror?
It's more or less a mirror. Actually, biologically, none of us are perfectly symmetric, but if you ran lots and lots of people, it would be close enough to a mirror, right? So it would be that way. Unless every once in a while you do find that the brain is asymmetric. So one of the things that we do in my lab is we found out that we're faster in our left visual field than we are in our right. So it could be that there is an asymmetry, but there's no reason to believe a priori that there would be. You would go with a mirror image is a good guess. I thought I saw another hand or two. Becca's got something.
Do you mind if we jump forward?
Please.
So
you tell me where to.
the picture where the graph with the two arrows that are
Like here and here?
Yeah.
One of these guys?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I understand that the same IID happens for these two horizontal positions.
Right.
But isn't that sort of metamer, if you will, resolved by the fact that it's in our different ears?
Okay.
So isn't that, so the levels are different, but you can localize it because it's coming from two different angles.
Very good. So it would be very, very good. Okay, so we're at the case that I'm looking straight ahead and I'm getting, if you will, positive 30 and negative 30. I can probably resolve those fairly easily. Okay? So those are probably not going to be metamers. They're physically different and they're distinguishable. Okay. I wonder if we can do it this way. Can you stay with me? And we're going to say here's 0, here's 90. So far, so good? Yeah. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go 45 degrees this way of 90 degrees, and 45 degrees that way. If I were that limber, I could move my arm all the way back there. And now I've got things that are both 45 degrees away from straight to my right. And those two are going to generate a metamer, or something like it, right? Something like it. And the reason is, this one isn't dead center on me. It's a little bit, it's at 45 degrees that way, and it's still going to hit my right ear first, right? This one is still going to hit my right ear first. Does that work for us?
Yeah.
So this is all within one side. It might be a little bit confusing. Okay? That's all on my right side, for example. Okay, why don't we go with one last question, we'll give it to Owen.
What else I found interesting was how the front-back differences aren't technically metamers, because I guess you could call it the proximal stimulus.
Yeah.
Once it gets in your ear canal, they aren't physically distinguishable.
Yeah, right. So and we can have a debate about whether those are metamers or not, but I find it fascinating that, we can tell this from this, we can tell that from that, but we can't tell front from back, right? They're wildly different in position. They couldn't be more different, and yet those are the ones that we confuse all the time, right? But, if you look at what's available to you at the two ears, you're getting 0 IID, 0 ITD in those two cases, so why wouldn't you get them mixed up? Good of you to point to the proximal stimulus, because that's what's driving our nervous system's response. We have to behave based on what our biology is doing. Our biology doesn't get any cues when it's dead center or directly from behind us, so our biology is at a standoff, and so our behavior reflects that biological fact. Okay, we're out of time. Thank you for a great conversation. We can talk about this a little bit on Friday. We'll also have the Skype session. Just to remind you, please read the article, be able to explain it to a novice, at least the general ideas, make a vocab list, and please, I hope you'll take advantage of this. Create a life after Denison question for Ray. It could be a professional question, it could be a personal question, but he's here to help. So look forward to our Skype session on Friday.